Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross was not a mystic. She was a woman of science, a psychiatrist at the University of Chicago, and she was exhausted. It was a late afternoon in the late 1960s, and the pressure from her academic peers had finally broken her resolve. They mocked her interest in the conversations of the dying. They called her research unscientific. Defeated, she decided to quit. She was packing her office, ready to abandon the work that would later define the 20th century. And then, the impossible walked through the door. A woman stood in front of her. Elizabeth recognized her immediately. It was Mrs. Schwartz. She looked pale, but solid, real. The problem was that Mrs. Schwartz had died and been buried weeks earlier. Elizabeth, suspecting a hallucination caused by fatigue, did what any rigorous scientist would do. She tested reality. She asked the woman to write a note on a piece of paper. The woman picked up a pen and wrote a message, touched Elizabeth's hand, which felt cold yet physical, and said, "Dr. Ross, you cannot give up your work on death and dying. The time is not right." Then she walked out. Elizabeth looked down at the paper. The note was still there. The ink was still wet. This event did not happen to a spiritual guru or a fantasy writer. It happened to the woman who would become the most respected authority on death in history. The architect of the 5 stages of grief. For decades, the world listened to her teach us how to die, but they ignored what she discovered next. Because when you sit by the bedside of 20,000 dying patients, you stop looking at death as an end. You start seeing it as a departure. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross gathered a body of evidence so compelling that it forced her to make a statement that shattered her scientific reputation. She said, "Death does not exist," and she wasn't speaking metaphorically. To understand the magnitude of her conclusions, we must first validate the observer. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross was not a soft-minded dreamer. She was a scientist forged in the harsh realities of post-war Europe. Before she became a literary icon, she was a medical volunteer in the liberated concentration camps of Poland. She had seen the absolute worst of human mortality, the raw and brutal biological end of life. There was no room for fantasy in her world. She trained at the University of Zurich, one of the most rigorous medical institutions on the planet. When she arrived in the United States to practice psychiatry, she wasn't looking for ghosts, she was looking for data. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways of the University of Chicago and the University of Colorado, she built a reputation for relentless, almost aggressive professionalism. At that time, the medical establishment viewed death as a failure to be hidden. Doctors would walk past the rooms of the terminally ill, ignoring them, pretending they weren't there. Elizabeth did the opposite. She walked in. She pulled up a chair. She turned on a tape recorder. It is crucial to note that she did not start this journey with a belief in the afterlife. In fact, she spent the first years of her research trying to disprove it. When patients began telling her about floating above their bodies or seeing deceased relatives waiting in the corner of the room, her first instinct was purely clinical. She checked their charts for heavy sedatives. She checked their oxygen levels to rule out hypoxia. She looked for signs of metabolic psychosis. She was the perfect skeptic. She had every incentive to explain these phenomena away as the random firing of a dying brain. But as she sat there year after year, compiling thousands of case studies, the clinical explanations began to collapse. The data was refusing to fit the materialist model. The witness was unimpeachable, and she was about to face a body of evidence that no medical textbook could explain. The turning point came when the anecdotes turned into a statistical impossibility. Elizabeth wasn't just hearing random hallucinations, she was documenting a structured, predictable protocol of departure. In over 20,000 cases, she identified a specific sequence of events that occurred regardless of the patient's religion, age, or culture. The first piece of hard evidence came from the blind. Elizabeth interviewed patients who had been blind for decades, some since birth. Yet when they returned from a moment of clinical death, they could describe with perfect visual accuracy the color of the doctor's tie, the pattern on the sweater of a nurse, or the specific jewelry worn by those trying to resuscitate them. A hallucinating brain cannot fabricate visual data it has never accessed. To Elizabeth, this was clinical proof that consciousness had detached from the damaged optical nerves and was operating independently. Then there was the phenomenon of the greeting committee. In her research, she noted that dying patients, often days before their vital signs failed, would begin to converse with invisible visitors. Materialist medicine called this terminal agitation. But Elizabeth cross-referenced the cases. She found that these patients were never visited by people who were still alive. They were only visited by those who had already crossed over. She documented cases where a dying child, who had been shielded from the news that her brother had died in a car accident just hours before, would wake up and tell her mother, "My brother is here. He says he's waiting for me." How could a dying brain hallucinate the one specific person who had actually died when the patient had no way of knowing that fact? Elizabeth distilled these thousands of observations into her most famous scientific metaphor. She stopped calling the body a person. She began calling it a cocoon. She concluded that what we observe as death is violent and messy only to the observer. To the experiencer, it is merely the shedding of a damaged shell. The consciousness, the butterfly, remains intact, observing the scene with heightened clarity, fully alive while the EKG flatlines. But the evidence went deeper than just visions. This research led her to identify a phenomenon that completely defies neurological explanation: terminal lucidity. She observed patients with severe dementia, schizophrenia, or brains ravaged by massive tumors, people who hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in years, suddenly regaining full, crystal-clear consciousness in their final moments. They would sit up, recognize their families, speak with profound wisdom, and say their goodbyes before passing away. Elizabeth posed the critical question: if the brain generates the mind, as materialists claim, how can a physically destroyed brain produce the most complex and coherent moment of a person's life? To her, this was the smoking gun. It proved that the brain is not the producer of consciousness, but merely a receiver, a biological radio. When the radio breaks, the signal doesn't die. It simply stops coming through the machine, and at the moment of death, the signal is finally liberated. Furthermore, her findings were not happening in a vacuum. In a moment of scientific synchronicity, she discovered that Dr. Raymond Moody was documenting the exact same patterns hundreds of miles away, completely independently. They compared notes and found an identical structure: the sensation of floating, the cessation of pain, and the encounter with a light that radiated total, unconditional love. Elizabeth noted that in the presence of this light, patients were forced to review their lives. But unlike religious dogmas of judgment, this review was self-inflicted. They felt the ripple effect of every choice they had ever made. This wasn't the chaotic firing of dying neurons. It was a structured moral lesson woven into the very fabric of the universe. If the clinical files of Dr. Kübler-Ross are accurate, then we are forced to confront a staggering implication. Our entire modern approach to death is based on a medical error. We treat death as the ultimate defeat, the final erasure of the self. But Elizabeth's data suggests that death is merely a migration. This changes everything about how we live, and more importantly, how we grieve. Elizabeth did not invalidate the pain of loss. She knew better than anyone that the pain of those left behind is visceral and real. But she reframed the source of that pain. We mourn the absence of their physical form, but we can no longer mourn their extinction. The evidence suggests that while we are standing on the shore, crying, "There she goes," there are others on a different shore, crying, "Here she comes." This perspective turns the hospital room from a place of tragedy into a departure lounge. It challenges the medical instinct to sedate the dying into oblivion. Elizabeth argued that by over-medicating patients in their final hours to spare them pain, we are often robbing them of the most lucid, transformative moment of their existence. We are treating a graduation like a disease. If consciousness is immortal, then life on Earth is not a random accident but a school. The hardships, the losses, the physical suffering, in the light of her research, these stop being cruel punishments and become the curriculum. She often told her students that windstorms are what shape the canyons. Without the wind, the rock remains smooth but uninteresting. If we accept her findings, we must accept that we are here to learn lessons that only a physical, finite life can teach us. The primary lesson she found was always the same: unconditional love, not as a sentiment, but as the fundamental physics of the dimension waiting next door. This shift in perspective does more than just comfort the grieving. It completely reorders our moral compass. Elizabeth's research highlighted a specific detail about the life review that is often overlooked. In that panoramic flash of the soul, patients reported that they didn't just remember their actions, they felt them. And crucially, they felt them from the perspective of the people they affected. If you struck someone in anger, you don't feel the blow of your hand. You feel the stinging of their cheek and their internal humiliation. This implies that the universe has a built-in mechanism of absolute justice, one that operates not through punishment, but through total connectivity. It validates the ancient golden rule not as a religious command, but as a law of metaphysical physics. Furthermore, this understanding bridges the gap between modern clinical observation and ancient wisdom. Elizabeth realized that the stages of detachment she observed in Chicago hospitals mirrored the exact stages described thousands of years ago in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. She wasn't discovering something new, she was scientifically validating a map that Western culture had thrown away. It implies that the dying process is a skill, a navigable terrain that we have forgotten how to traverse, leaving us unprepared for the most significant journey of our lives. Yet, for all her data, Dr. Kübler-Ross eventually hit a wall that no amount of research could breach. She could map the process of dying, but she could not fully articulate the destination. In her final interviews, when pressed to describe the light that her patients encountered, the articulate scientist would stumble. She realized that human language is a tool designed for a three-dimensional world, utterly incapable of describing a multi-dimensional reality. She spoke of a love that was not an emotion, but a substance, a living, breathing fabric of the universe that held everything together. She said that in the presence of this light, judgment was impossible, because to judge would be to misunderstand the nature of existence. But this revelation brought with it a profound mystery, a question that haunted her. If the afterlife is a realm of such total perfection and unconditional love, why are we here? Why must the butterfly endure the struggle of the cocoon at all? Elizabeth posited that this realm of light lacks one specific thing: resistance. Without the heaviness of the physical body, without the friction of loss and pain, the soul cannot grow certain muscles. We come here, she suggested, to learn the lessons that only suffering can teach, but the ultimate nature of the source, the intelligence behind this curriculum, remained just beyond the veil. She stood at the edge of the map, pointing at a territory she could see, but could not bring back in a test tube. This boundary wasn't just theoretical for Elizabeth, it became deeply personal. She eventually grew tired of merely recording the journeys of others and sought to glimpse the terrain herself. In her later years, she ventured into experimental territory, collaborating with Robert Monroe, a pioneer in out-of-body research. Through these explorations, she experienced a state she called cosmic consciousness. She described a sensation of vibrating at such a high speed that the physical world seemed to slow down and dissolve. In this state, she claimed to become the space between the atoms, perceiving a connection to every living thing, from a blade of grass to a distant star. It was a knowledge so profound that it terrified her scientific mind, for there was no subject and object anymore, only a singular pulsing unity. And yet, this vast knowledge came with a final, ironic sting. The ultimate limit she faced was that knowing the map does not give you control over the journey. The woman who taught the world how to die spent her final years furious and impatient, waiting for a death that refused to come quickly. She had seen the graduation, and she was desperate to leave the classroom. But the mystery held her here. It was a stark reminder that the other side operates on a timing that is completely indifferent to human will. The final lesson the expert had to learn was that you cannot rush the sunset. The soul leaves only when the curriculum is truly complete, a timing known only to the silent intelligence she had spent a lifetime trying to understand. You would assume that a discovery of this magnitude, evidence that consciousness survives death, would be celebrated as the greatest breakthrough in medical history. Instead, it destroyed her career. This is the tragedy of the paradigm barrier. The medical establishment loved Elizabeth Kübler-Ross when she was the death and dying lady, the compassionate doctor, teaching us how to say goodbye. But the moment she crossed the line from grief to survival, the doors slammed shut. When she published her findings on life after death, the academic community didn't debate her data. They attacked her sanity. Colleagues who had once given her standing ovations now crossed the street to avoid her. The University of Chicago, embarrassed by her talk of spirits and light, distanced itself. They labeled her research as the delusions of a woman who had spent too much time looking into the abyss. Materialist critics scrambled to explain away her 20,000 cases. They invoked hypoxia, the theory that a starving brain releases chemicals that cause hallucinations. They blamed endorphins, ketamine-like receptors, and psychological wish fulfillment. But Elizabeth stood her ground. She pointed out a flaw in their logic that they could not answer. Hypoxia results in chaos, confusion, and agitation. Her patients, however, were experiencing hyperlucidity, structured narratives, and profound peace. A dying, oxygen-starved brain does not suddenly acquire the ability to see things happening in other rooms. It shuts down. It does not expand. The resistance culminated in violence. Her healing center in Virginia, filled with her life's work and thousands of case files, was set on fire in an act of arson. She lost everything: her papers, her journals, her possessions. But standing in the ashes of her home, she demonstrated the very lesson she had learned from her patients. She saw it not as a tragedy, but as a liberation from material attachments. The scientific community tried to burn the evidence, but they could not burn the truth she had seen. She had committed the ultimate scientific heresy. She proved that the observer is greater than the machine. Now that you have seen the evidence, you are left with a choice. You can continue to view death through the lens of fear, as a final darkness that erases everything you are. Or you can look through the lens of Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. If her findings are true, then the greatest fear of the human experience is an illusion. Imagine how you would live your life today if you knew with absolute certainty that you are unbreakable. If you knew that this physical reality is just a temporary classroom and that the end is actually a graduation. Elizabeth's legacy is not just about comfort. It is a call to courage. She asks us to live fully, to love without holding back, and to treat every hardship not as a punishment, but as the friction necessary to break the cocoon. She taught us that we are not human beings trying to be spiritual. We are spiritual beings having a very brief, very intense human experience. If this investigation resonates with the questions you've been asking, subscribe to continue the great exploration. This concludes our inquiry for now, a synthesis of documented clinical evidence and timeless philosophical questions, grounded in the sources that guide our journey. If death is merely the moment the butterfly leaves the cocoon, what colors are you creating for your wings right now?